The last week at the Meadowlark Resort, Big Gene's back went out. He hurt himself years before racing motorcycles and had a broken back. Every now and then it would go out and he couldn't hardly move. The pain would be so bad that he could only sleep an hour at a time. The third day of this pain and immobility of the big buffalo man, I looked at the Rand McNally map and noticed we were about 70 miles from a town full of hot springs, Thermopolis, Wyoming. I said, Big Gene, let's move down to the town full of hot springs and see if they'll help your back. We'd made a couple $100 and we were ready to go, and the truck was fixed, and we kissed everybody goodbye and made all the ladies cry, thanked the powers that be, and moved on down the road. As we drove down that beautiful mountain, we saw bighorn sheep and some of the most incredible scenes that human eyes can see. There are more fantastic things to view in this country if you just get in Mountain John's vehicle than your mind could possibly believe. I've thought for years I should take people who really want to see this country on private tours. I constantly see things that other people don't seem to find. They go on their tiny little 2-week vacation and they are in such a hurry they miss the beauty. If you drive 25 or 30 instead of 65 and 70 miles an hour, you see it all. Slow down and stop. Make your vacation 3 months long instead of 2 weeks. On the way down the mountain, we burnt out the trailer brakes. We got to Thermopolis, checked into a campground. The next day I took the old man to the Hot Springs State Park. We looked like two polar bears swimming around in the mineral pools. We stayed several hours. We got back to the trailer and Gene slept for about 8 hours straight through. I found a shop that would fix the brakes and Gene felt better. Eventually I wandered into town to see what I could see. It was an old cattle town. The streets were wide enough to herd 3,000 head of cows or sheep through the town. Main Street was about 5 blocks long, and businesses and shops lined each side. I noticed a couple of bars and a liquor store, a couple of banks, a clothing store, junk store, newspaper, and a couple of restaurants. That was about it. I strolled along and finally found a store that sold cowboy hats. A fellow that looked a lot like Gene Autry was there. He was strumming an old guitar. It needed to be tuned. He thumbed along and sang as I browsed through the hats, and he finally asked, "Do you know anything about guitars?" I said, "Oh, a little. Why?" He said, "I can't seem to get this thing in tune." I walked over to take a closer look. I reached my hand out and said, "Mountain John." He shook my hand and said, "Gary Anderson." He handed me that old guitar, and I started tuning it by ear. It was in need of a lot of repairs. I got it as close to tuned as it was going to get, and then I sang a song, and his eyes lit up, and when I was done, he recited a poem he'd written about loneliness and working cows on a ranch. I said, "Gary, that poem is great," and then recited one of mine for him. We laughed, and he said, "What are you doing in Thermopolis?" Well, I told him the story, and he said, "Hell, Mountain John, I'd like to follow you out to the campground and meet your grandfather, Big Gene. Would it be all right if I closed up and drove you out there?" I said, "I'd appreciate the ride." One thing led to another, and Gary and I became good friends. The next day I drove to town and saw a sign for Wyoming Realty. An attractive woman told me she would show me all the places in town for sale. Now, I knew I only had $200, but Debbie had told me before I left to keep an eye open for property that she could invest in. As this lady drove me around, I realized the whole town was for sale. Originally, Thermopolis was owned by the Shoshone Indians. The chief would go and sit in the hot springs, and buffalo, moose, deer, and antelope would come to the springs to eat and drink. The chief never had to get out of the water to supply his family with meat. From the early 1800s to the mid-1800s, Wyoming became a major trapping area for beaver and other fur-bearing animals. The mountain men invaded the Rockies for fur and freedom. Then the cattle ranchers from Texas arrived, and then the sheep owners, and then the pioneers. It wasn't long until Butch Cassidy and the Hole in the Wall gang showed up and all hell broke loose. Between the Johnson County wars, between the sheep owners and the cattlemen and the stealing and bank and train robberies, the chief didn't want the springs anymore. There were no animals, and the chief sold the springs and several thousand acres to the President of the United States. The government came in and ran off the Indians and Butch and the boys. And they then forced the cattlemen and sheepmen to get along, and the pioneers moved in, and Wyoming slowly gave way to towns and fences and domestic crap. Trains, electricity, banks, stores, farming. Then came the oil companies. Oh shit, Yahoo. Amen.